What would you sacrifice to give a king his dream? Your freedom? Your love? Your life? Jane Seymour did all three. She stepped into the blood-stained shoes of Anne Boleyn and gave Henry VIII the one thing he wanted more than any woman, a son. But the same birth that crowned her queen also became her death sentence. While England rejoiced, its quietest queen was dying behind the palace walls, her final breath forgotten beneath the sound of celebration. Her story isn't about glory, it's about sacrifice, and it's about the cost of loving a man who valued heirs over hearts. If you believe every story deserves to be remembered, hit subscribe. Her story begins where another ended. When Anne Boleyn's head fell, England held its breath. The king's second wife, brilliant, defiant, and doomed, was gone. Her fall left more than a widow and a broken crown. It left a kingdom haunted by whispers, and a king tormented by his own choices. Yet, in that silence, another name began to circulate through the court. Jane Seymour. She was no court schemer, no temptress. She did not challenge the king, nor dazzle him with wit. She was calm. She was compliant. And in a court that had bled from ambition, that was exactly what Henry wanted. To him, Jane was peace-dressed in gentleness, a contrast so sharp it soothed the guilt that Anne's death could not erase. Jane had served both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. She had seen the cost of being loved by a Tudor king. Yet when Henry's eyes turned to her, she did not refuse him. Perhaps she believed obedience would save her where rebellion had destroyed others. Perhaps she believed she could heal him. History never tells us what she truly thought, only that she stepped forward when others would have fled. The court noticed. They whispered that Jane was everything Anne was not. She spoke softly, lowered her eyes, and obeyed before being asked. Where Anne had argued, Jane listened. Where Anne had dazzled, Jane disappeared into humility. In a world ruled by men who feared clever women, she fit the mold of safety. Henry saw her as a gift from God, a chance for redemption, a woman untouched by scandal, yet close enough to the throne to understand its dangers. His pursuit was relentless. To him, Jane's purity washed away the blood of Anne Boleyn. To others, it was simply another execution paving the path to a new queen. When he proposed, there was no grandeur, no thunder of celebration, no festival of victory. Just a swift coronation for a king desperate to rewrite his story. Within days of Anne's death, Jane Seymour became Queen of England. Some called it destiny, others called it indecency. But Jane was no conqueror. She did not claim victory over Anne, she inherited her ghost. Every step she took was shadowed by memory, the memory of a woman who had died for the same crown now resting on Jane's head. Courtiers still spoke Anne's name in private, servants still whispered her last words, and even Henry's affection carried traces of mourning. Jane's challenge was not to be adored, but to survive the legacy of the woman before her. She chose silence as her weapon. Where the court expected her to flaunt her new power, she retreated into duty. She focused on healing the royal family's divisions, starting with the king's estranged daughter, Mary. The girl who had once called Anne Boleyn a usurper now found a friend in Jane Seymour. Jane urged Henry to forgive her, to restore her to favor. It was one of the few times she defied him, and she did it not for ambition, but for compassion. That compassion became her defining trait. It earned her the love of the people and the loyalty of those who had grown weary of court scandals. But it also placed her in the center of a dangerous balance. Every kind act toward Mary reminded the world of Catherine of Aragon. Every tender word about reconciliation whispered too close to treason. Henry, however, was blind to such subtleties. To him, Jane's kindness was proof of her virtue. He believed he had finally found a woman who understood her place, obedient, pure, and loyal. He declared her the perfect queen, the one chosen by divine will to bear him the son that had eluded him for decades. The pressure on Jane was enormous, though unspoken. The nation looked to her womb as England's last hope for stability. In her quiet moments, she must have felt the weight of that expectation. She was not loved for herself, but for what she might give. Every smile, every meal, every night beside Henry was a test of destiny. And yet, she never complained. She performed her role with gentle grace, avoiding politics, avoiding controversy. When others sought favor, she offered prayer. When rumors swirled, she kept her silence. That silence was her strength and her shield. The courtiers began calling her the true queen. The common people praised her as the good woman. But beneath the praise, the court still trembled with unease. Henry's love was fierce but fragile. They had seen it before, how devotion could curdle into fury when denied an heir. They wondered if Jane's gentleness could survive his impatience. Time proved she could, for now. She became the balm on a wounded crown, the gentle whisper after years of shouting. Yet in private, even Jane must have sensed that she was not merely Henry's wife, but his redemption project. He loved her not only for who she was, but for what she erased. The shame of Anne, the rebellion of Catherine, the chaos of his own making. And so Jane lived between two ghosts. One, the ghost of the woman whose execution had made her queen. The other, the ghost of a promise, the son Henry demanded from her. She embodied peace, but she lived surrounded by echoes. Every prayer she offered was shadowed by what came before. Every smile was built upon the memory of blood. And though she did not know it, her destiny would mirror theirs in one final devastating way. Because history has its own cruel symmetry. The woman who rose upon another's death would soon meet her own. Her crown was made of calmness and grace. But beneath it, fate was already whispering her name, and as England celebrated its new queen, gentle, humble, beloved, none yet realized the truth the ages would remember. The queen who replaced a ghost would soon become one herself. Henry's affection for Jane Seymour began not with fireworks, but with quietness. After the storm that was Anne Boleyn, Jane's calmness felt like a harbor. She did not challenge him, mock him, or play his games. She listened. She bowed her head when he spoke. And for a man who ruled through ego and fear, that kind of gentleness was disarming. It made him feel not like a king, but like a man again. Jane understood Henry's wounds better than most. The death of his first marriage, the betrayal of his second, and the shame of having two daughters instead of a son had hollowed him. He was powerful beyond measure, yet deeply insecure. Jane didn't need to flatter him. Her presence was her power. She gave him something the court had forgotten to offer: peace. To Henry, that peace became an obsession. His courtiers noticed the change almost immediately. The king laughed more. He dined longer. He called Jane my sweet and most virtuous lady. Even his temper, famous for sudden bursts of rage, seemed tamed by her serenity. When she walked into a room, it wasn't with the boldness of Anne or the dignity of Catherine, but with the humility of someone who knew the danger of being seen. Her influence on him grew in subtle ways. Jane urged reconciliation between Henry and his estranged daughter, Princess Mary. Against the advice of many, she convinced the king to forgive his eldest child and restore her to the line of succession. It was one of Jane's most compassionate acts, and one of Henry's few tender moments as a father. Through Jane, he glimpsed the family he might have been capable of having. But behind the warmth lay shadows of guilt. Every smile Henry gave Jane carried the ghost of Anne Boleyn's execution. Every glance toward his new wife was haunted by the woman who had died so he could marry her. Jane rarely spoke of it. She prayed quietly and avoided gossip, but she knew her crown was bought with blood. The court whispered it too, though never loud enough for the king to hear. Jane's reign was brief, but remarkably stable. She brought modesty back to the court. Extravagant gowns gave way to plain silks. Feasts grew quieter. Henry liked it that way. He said Jane reminded him of his mother, Elizabeth of York. To him, Jane represented order, purity, and the hope of a son. To the rest of England, she became the promise of continuity after years of scandal. Yet beneath the stillness, the pressure grew. Jane's worth, in the eyes of the crown, depended on one thing: giving birth to a male heir. She knew it. Everyone did. Her marriage might have been peaceful, but it was not free. Each day she carried the unspoken fear that haunted all of Henry's wives: failure. Her affection for Henry seemed genuine. Perhaps she pitied him, perhaps she loved him, or perhaps she simply believed her role was to heal what others had broken. But she never used her influence for power. She did not seek titles for her family or demand riches. Her brothers, Edward and Thomas Seymour, were more ambitious. They saw Jane's queenship as a ladder, but Jane herself seemed content in simplicity. Her goal was singular: to secure England's future through an heir. Henry's affection deepened into dependence. To him, Jane was not just a wife, She was redemption. When ambassadors wrote to foreign courts, they spoke of a new Henry, softer, almost sentimental. He called Jane the only true wife I ever had, words that history would remember long after his other marriages crumbled. And yet, in that affection lay tragedy. Henry's love was conditional, shaped by his hunger for an heir. Jane understood this too well. She smiled when courtiers praised her gentleness, but she knew gentleness would not protect her if she failed him. She prayed nightly for a son, knowing that her future, her life, rested on what she could give the king. Still, for a fleeting moment, she knew happiness. Letters from the time describe her laughter, her care for her ladies, her attention to small kindnesses. When the plague spread through London, Jane insisted that servants and the poor around the palace receive food and comfort. To her attendants, she was not just a queen, she was a woman of mercy. Henry, for his part, seemed genuinely devoted. He stayed close to her side, praised her virtue, and shielded her from the harsh politics that had destroyed his former queens. He built her private gardens, ordered musicians to play soft hymns, and often declared before his court that he had at last found peace. But behind every proclamation of joy was a silent truth. Jane's entire identity revolved around his need. Her brief months as queen carried a fragile stillness, the eye of a storm that everyone sensed would not last. Foreign ambassadors recorded that Jane appeared pale, often tired, and perhaps already weakened by the strain of expectation. Yet, in public, she remained serene. She embodied the ideal Tudor queen, obedient, pious, maternal. Henry believed his search for love had ended. He saw Jane as a divine gift, proof that God had forgiven him for the turmoil of his earlier marriages. He promised her that when she gave him a son, he would build her a monument greater than any queen before her. She smiled, not knowing that promise would soon become a tomb. As the months passed, Jane became pregnant. Henry rejoiced, declaring to his court that England's future was secure. He ordered prayers across the kingdom. He visited Jane daily, holding her hand, calling her his sweetheart before his attendants. But his joy carried a sharp edge, the pressure of hope so great it felt like prophecy. For Jane, it was both blessing and burden. She was about to fulfill her purpose as queen, but it would come at a cost history would never forget. The calm that once defined her life began to feel like silence before collapse. Henry, lost in his joy, never saw it coming. To him, Jane was the answer to all his failures, the wife who soothed his spirit, the queen who would save his dynasty. He adored her not for her power, but for her peace, the peace that would die with her. The court had waited years for this moment. Henry had prayed, raged, and remarried for it. Every decision, every execution, every broken vow, all had led to this one fragile hope. A son, an heir, the continuation of the Tudor name. Inside Hampton Court, the Queen's cries became the heartbeat of the nation. For 3 endless days, Jane Seymour endured labor that pushed her beyond the limits of her body. Each hour brought hope, then fear, then silence. The physicians whispered. The ladies of the chamber knelt in prayer. No one dared speak of failure. Not now, not after all England had sacrificed. Jane's strength was failing, yet she refused to yield. She had carried not just a child, but the weight of a kingdom. Every breath was an act of devotion, not only to her husband, but to the destiny of England itself. Henry waited nearby, restless and consumed. He had known war, betrayal, and death, but nothing frightened him more than the thought of losing another wife without a son. Jane had given him peace after Anne's chaos. She was his comfort, his redemption. If she failed, it would not only destroy the dream, it would destroy the illusion that God still favored him. At last, after endless agony, a cry echoed through the corridors. A child's cry. Strong, piercing, alive. The son had arrived. The attendants wept. The midwives crossed themselves. The messenger fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the meaning of that sound. In that single moment, England changed. The long drought of uncertainty was over. Henry burst into tears when he heard the words, "A prince, your majesty." He embraced his servants, his eyes shining with gratitude and relief. To him, it was not just the birth of a child. It was the birth of hope, the proof that his bloodline would continue, that God had forgiven him for all he had done to secure this moment. He rushed to Jane's bedside, full of pride and tenderness. For the first time in years, he saw the future laid before him, clear, divine, secure. He thanked her again and again, kissing her hands, calling her his true wife. The room filled with joy, but beneath the surface, something darker stirred. Jane smiled weakly, her voice barely a whisper. She had given Henry his son, the son he had built his kingdom upon. In that brief exchange between them, her fading breath and his overflowing gratitude, there was both triumph and tragedy. The christening of Prince Edward was a spectacle. Nobles from across England attended, their faces bright with the reflection of their king's joy. Henry stood tall, proud, transformed. For years he had feared God's curse. Now he felt blessed. He declared Jane the most beloved queen of all, promising that her name would be remembered forever. But as the bells of celebration rang across the kingdom, the queen who made it all possible was slipping away. Her body, drained from labor, began to betray her. Fever set in, silent, creeping, cruel. It began as exhaustion, something the court brushed off as natural after childbirth. Yet within days, the whispers returned. The same kind of whispers that once surrounded Anne, that once haunted Catherine. Jane's health faltered. She struggled to sit up, struggled to breathe. The smiles faded from the attendants' faces. The king was told not to worry, that rest would heal her. But the truth could no longer be hidden. The queen was dying. Henry visited her often in those early days, but each time he entered the chamber, her pallor deepened. He tried to speak of joy, of their son, of God's mercy, but Jane's eyes, soft and unfocused, seemed to drift beyond him. Her body had done what it was destined to do, and now it was surrendering. In private, Henry wept. For all his power, he was helpless. He had conquered kingdoms, but not this. He had broken laws for love, but love itself was leaving him. Those who served him said he paced through the corridors alone at night, repeating her name under his breath like a prayer. Jane, even in pain, remained gentle. She asked to see her son once more. They carried the infant prince to her bedside. She touched his small hand and smiled faintly. Those who witnessed it said there was peace in her face, the peace of a mother who knew her purpose was complete. She whispered a blessing for him, asking that he grow strong, kind, and loved. Her voice trembled, but her eyes shone with something eternal. Henry held her hand, promising that she would recover, that they would raise their son together. She nodded but said nothing. There are moments in history when silence says more than any vow. The queen's fever worsened. The physicians did all they could, though even their finest efforts were futile against the infection that followed childbirth. Day by day, she slipped further away. The palace that had celebrated her triumph now fell into mourning. Curtains were drawn, candles burned for her recovery. When news spread beyond the palace walls, the nation wept. The people who had once doubted her now prayed for her. They remembered her kindness, her mercy toward the king's daughter Mary, her patience in a court that thrived on cruelty. For a brief moment, Jane Seymour had united England, through love, through sacrifice, through her quiet strength. But love could not save her. Power could not heal her. Prayers could not bargain with fate. On the 12th day after Edward's birth, the queen's breathing grew shallow. Henry was called to her side. He knelt beside her, whispering words she could no longer hear. In the stillness of that room, the man who had defied popes and armies bowed to something greater than himself, loss. Jane died quietly, her hand resting near her child's blanket. She had fulfilled the single duty expected of her, to give England a prince. But the cost was her life. Outside, bells rang across London. The people rejoiced for the new heir. They sang hymns and gave thanks for the future king. They did not yet know that, even as they celebrated, their queen's body had gone cold. While the bells of London sang for a prince, the queen who gave him life lay dying. And though centuries would pass, that single truth would remain. England gained its heir, but lost its heart. Jane Seymour's triumph should have been her beginning. She had done what no queen before her could, given Henry VIII the son he had long prayed for. The court had celebrated with feasts, bells, and songs that carried her name, but behind the palace doors her strength was slipping away. The woman who had given life to England's future was quietly losing her own. At first, no one wanted to believe it. The midwives spoke of exhaustion, of the toll of a long labor. Henry ordered prayers and thanked God for his heir, convinced that the queen only needed rest. Yet the truth was crueler. Jane's body was fading from within, taken by what physicians would later call childbed fever, a silent infection that struck when joy was at its highest. The queen's attendants noticed it first. Her pulse weakened. Her color paled. She could not eat, could barely whisper. The court physician tried every remedy known to Tudor medicine. Herbs, broth, whispered prayers, but nothing brought warmth back to her. The fever grew relentless. Henry refused to hear it. The same king who had once dismissed wives with ruthless precision now stood helpless, terrified. He canceled all celebrations, shutting himself away from the court. Servants said his eyes looked hollow, as if he had seen death waiting outside her door. For the first time, the most powerful man in England could command nothing. He had broken from Rome, defied popes and nobles, but he could not command life to stay within his queen. Jane, even in agony, thought of her child. She asked to see her son again, the boy named Edward, the prince England had prayed for. They brought him to her bedside, swaddled in white silk. She touched his cheek with trembling fingers. Witnesses said she smiled faintly, whispering, "My boy, my precious boy." The moment lasted only seconds, but it became eternal in memory. Every chronicler of the Tudor court wrote of that gesture, the tenderness of a dying mother who knew her task was complete. Henry sat beside her, clutching her hand, begging her to live. To those who saw him then, he was not a tyrant or a king, only a husband drowning in guilt. He had lost 2 wives to cruelty and politics. He would lose this one to nature itself. He called her the fairest, the gentlest, and the purest soul that ever lived. Those words, recorded by his courtiers, were perhaps the only truth Henry ever spoke without power in it. As the fever worsened, Jane drifted in and out of consciousness. The priest was called. He prayed over her, offering the final rites. She accepted them calmly, her faith unbroken. Some said she asked Henry to care for her son, others that she simply asked for peace. Her attendants described her as serene, as though she had already made peace with death. In those final hours, the court fell silent. The halls that had once echoed with music now held their breath. Henry waited outside her chamber, refusing food, pacing like a man on trial. Every few minutes he asked for news. Every answer wounded him more. When the end came, it came quietly. There was no cry, no struggle, only a whisper, her last breath carrying a mother's farewell. One chronicler claimed her final words were of gratitude, that she thanked God for giving her the honor of being Edward's mother. Another wrote that she asked for Henry's forgiveness, though history suspects he needed hers far more. Henry did not speak for days after her passing. He ordered her rooms sealed, her clothing untouched. No queen was to replace her, not yet. In his grief, he wore black for months, a gesture rare for a king who had once turned mourning into ceremony. He called her his true wife. He said she had given him what all others had failed to provide, both peace and a son. The court moved with ritual precision. The queen's body was prepared for burial, wrapped in fine linen, laid in a coffin of oak and lead. Bells tolled across England as priests sang solemn prayers. Every noblewoman wore black. Even those who had envied her wept, for they knew the crown she wore had never been light. But beneath all ceremony lay a truth no proclamation could hide. Jane Seymour's death was the price of Henry's dream. She had succeeded where 2 queens had fallen, and it destroyed her. In time, her son would rule briefly, sickly and alone. The empire she died to secure would soon fall into chaos. But in Henry's mind, her memory was preserved like a sacred relic. He would remarry, yes, but his heart remained sealed beside her tomb. When he ordered the construction of his own resting place at St. Serpis School, George's Chapel in Windsor, he commanded that Jane be buried beside him. Not Anne, not Catherine, only Jane. Historians would later call her the Queen Henry truly loved. Yet her love story was written in loss, her devotion measured by her death. She had never sought to outshine or outwit. She had obeyed, served, and loved. And in the end, she became immortal through tragedy. Even centuries later, her image lingers in portraits, pale, gentle, eternally calm. Artists painted her with folded hands and downcast eyes, as if still praying for the peace she never found in life. And somewhere in every history of Henry VIII, her name appears as a pause, a moment of stillness amid violence, a fleeting glimpse of purity in a reign soaked with betrayal. If the story of the Tudors is one of power and destruction, then Jane Seymour stands as its quiet contradiction, the woman who changed everything, not through ambition, but through surrender. Her life ended within days of her greatest triumph. Yet in that brief reign, she gave England its heir, softened its king, and reminded history that even the mightiest throne rests on fragile lives. Henry's words after her death echo through time. She died in childbed, giving me a male child. Never shall I see her like again. The chronicles end there. But her story does not. Her son's reign would prove short. The Tudor dream she died for would crumble. And in the great ledger of history, Jane Seymour's name would stand alone, the queen who gave everything for a nation that could only mourn her too late. The cradle rocked, the candle died, and England fell silent. The news of Jane Seymour's death spread through the court like a slow, suffocating silence. Servants spoke her name in whispers, courtiers lowered their eyes, and even Henry, a king who had ordered the deaths of wives and men alike, vanished from sight. Jane, the woman who had brought peace to his troubled reign, was gone. And with her went the last unbroken part of his heart. He had celebrated only days before, holding his long-awaited son, Prince Edward. The kingdom rejoiced, the bells had rung, the lineage of the Tudors seemed secure at last. But now the joy turned to grief. The prince lived, yet the queen who bore him would never see him grow. It was a cruel symmetry, a mother's sacrifice for a dynasty's survival. Henry had won the heir he long desired, but it came at a cost that power could not repay. In his private chambers, Henry refused to speak of her death. He ordered that no one disturb his mourning. He did not appear at council meetings, nor did he greet his subjects. He remained alone, surrounded by memories that no longer comforted him. Those close to him described his silence as frightening. For the first time in years, the king who commanded fear now seemed broken by it. He had lost wives before, one divorced, one executed, but Jane's passing was different. There had been no scandal, no betrayal, no defiance. She had given him everything he wanted, obedience, affection, and an heir. There was nothing to blame, no sin to punish. Only death itself stood between him and the one woman who seemed to calm the storm inside him. When Jane's body was prepared for burial, Henry personally oversaw the details. Her coffin was draped in royal cloth, marked not just as queen, but as the mother of the heir. He ordered that she be given honors no other wife of his would ever receive. Courtiers noticed something almost reverent in his instructions. For once, Henry did not rage against fate. He seemed to submit to it. Jane was laid to rest at St. Therese, George's chapel in Windsor Castle, a sacred place reserved for kings. Henry commanded that he too would one day be buried beside her. And so it was decided. In death, she would remain by his side forever. His later wives might share his throne, but not his grave. As her funeral procession passed, people wept openly. They called her the Good Queen, the Gentle One, the Peace-bringer. She had been queen for only 17 months, yet she had captured the heart of a kingdom exhausted by turmoil. Even those who once favored Anne Boleyn admitted that Jane's quiet grace had soothed the chaos of court life. The chroniclers of the time wrote that Henry's grief changed him. He emerged from mourning colder, heavier, and less trusting. The once energetic king became increasingly isolated. He began to associate love with loss, loyalty with danger. Those who had known him before, Jane said the light in his eyes dimmed after her death. Even his later marriages seemed haunted by her memory. When he married Anne of Cleves, the union was brief and loveless. Henry compared every woman to Jane. None could match her calm spirit. Catherine Howard brought him fleeting joy, but her execution reopened the wound Jane's death had left. With Catherine Parr, his final wife, he found companionship but not peace. Through every alliance, every betrayal, and every fading affection, Jane remained the silent presence behind his throne. Historians often debate whether Henry truly loved any of his wives. But in his actions after Jane's death lies the answer. He built a tomb large enough for two, not for himself and the queen he would one day die beside, but for himself and the woman who had given him what he believed was immortality, a son to inherit his name. Even in his later years, when age and illness consumed him, Henry spoke fondly of Jane. He called her his true wife, the only one who had brought him both peace and pride. Courtiers recorded that he kept her portrait close, refusing to let it be removed from his chambers. To him, Jane symbolized not only love but divine favor, the proof that God had finally blessed his union. Yet history reveals the irony. The prince Jane died to bring into the world, Edward VI would rule for only 6 short years before dying at the age of 15. Her sacrifice, meant to secure the Tudor line, instead marked its slow decline. The dynasty that had demanded her life would crumble within a generation. Still, Jane's legacy endured in a different way. She became the idealized queen, gentle, loyal, and pure. In paintings and chronicles, her image softened the harsh reputation of Henry's reign. Artists portrayed her with a halo-like serenity, the queen who smiled faintly from eternity, untouched by scandal. She was the Tudor rose who bloomed and withered in the same season. Henry ensured that her memory remained untarnished. No word against Jane was ever tolerated at court. To insult her was to insult the king himself. In his mind, she had ascended beyond mortality, part saint, part symbol, forever preserved in his grief. Her name became a measure by which all future queens were judged and found wanting. As years passed, her absence shaped the myth of Henry as much as her presence once had. His later cruelty, his paranoia, his desperate pursuit of control, all seemed to trace back to the day he lost her. The court had feared Anne Boleyn's ambition, mocked Catherine Howard's youth, and pitied Catherine of Aragon's endurance, but Jane inspired something different. Pity turned into reverence, sorrow hardened into legend. When Henry died in 1547, he was laid to rest exactly where he had ordered, beside Jane Seymour, under the grand stone of St. Seymour. George's Chapel. The man who had outlived 6 queens now rested beside the only one he claimed to love. Visitors who stand before their tomb today see no trace of passion or pain, only the calm symmetry of 2 figures united in eternal silence. But to those who know their story, that silence speaks volumes. It tells of a woman who entered history quietly, changed it forever, and vanished before she could witness her legacy. It tells of a king who gained everything he wanted, only to discover that power cannot buy peace. In the end, Jane Seymour became more than Henry's 3rd wife. She became his memory, his myth, his mirror. Every choice he made afterward was shadowed by her absence. Every love that followed was compared to the one he lost. He would marry 4 more times, but only one woman would share his grave. And so history remembers her, not as the queen who ruled England, but as the queen who died to secure it. In the end, she became not just the woman Henry loved, but the ghost he never escaped. History remembers kings for what they built, and queens for what they endured. Jane Seymour's reign lasted barely 18 months, yet her shadow stretched far beyond her time. She never ruled with iron or intrigue, never led armies, and never schemed for power. Her strength was quieter, the kind that asks for nothing yet gives everything. In the ruthless world of the Tudors, that quietness was not weakness. It was sacrifice disguised as grace. Henry VIII once called her his true wife. Some say it was because she gave him the son he wanted more than anything. Others believe it was guilt, the price of a conscience haunted by blood. Whatever the reason, Jane became the ideal he could never recreate. Every wife who followed her was compared to her calm, her obedience, her silent devotion. But what they could not see was the cost behind that perfection. Jane Seymour's gentleness was the armor that hid her pain. Her son, Edward VI, was the living symbol of her triumph and the tragedy of her loss. England hailed him as the future, the golden child of the Tudor line, but destiny would prove cruel. Edward reigned for only 6 years. A frail boy raised in the shadow of his father's power and his mother's ghost, he never knew the woman who gave him life. When he died at 15, the great Tudor dream, the very reason for Jane's death, began to crumble. Her sacrifice had bought an heir, but not a future. In that irony lies the essence of Jane Seymour's legacy. She gave England its prince, yet the stability he represented vanished as quickly as it came. After Edward's death, the kingdom descended once again into uncertainty. The throne passed between rival queens, and the very faith Henry built his empire upon was torn apart by his children. Jane's death was meant to seal the Tudor line. Instead, it became the first crack in its foundation. Still, to Henry, Jane remained untouched by scandal. Catherine of Aragon had defied him. Anne Boleyn had challenged him. Jane had submitted, and for that, he crowned her not only in life, but in death. When the time came for Henry to choose his resting place, he ordered to be buried beside Jane. Not Catherine, not Anne, not any of the others who came after, only Jane. She alone, in his mind, was worthy of eternity beside the King of England. That decision was not born purely of love. It was also born of myth. Henry needed one story to end in peace, one wife to sanctify the chaos his marriages had caused. Jane became that story. The perfect queen who brought him redemption, who gave England its heir, and who died before she could disappoint him. Death, in a cruel way, preserved her image. She never grew older, never argued, never fell from grace. In dying young, she became the eternal symbol of purity that history demanded. Centuries later, her name still evokes a strange tenderness. She was the calm between two storms, Anne's destruction and Henry's decay. A bridge between love and loss, between the violence of passion and the silence of duty. Her story reminds us that in royal history, triumph often wears the mask of tragedy. Jane Seymour achieved everything expected of a queen, yet lost everything that made her human. Her legacy is not written in the victories of power, but in the weight of sacrifice. She represents every woman erased by duty, every soul remembered only for what they gave, not who they were. Her life may have been brief, but it taught England something profound, that even in a world ruled by kings, it is often a woman's suffering that secures a dynasty's crown. 3 queens had fallen to give England its heir. Catherine's endurance, Anne's defiance, Jane's death. Each one paid a different price. And so, as the story closes, history dims its light and whispers one truth: Jane Seymour, the queen who won England's heart not by ruling it, but by dying for it.